Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Loremaker's Guide to the Galaxy, where we spotlight one of the many star systems in the Star Citizen universe and talk about the system itself, a bit about its history, and some insight into some of the choices that we made when kind of coming up with it and conceiving it. I'm Dave Haddock. I'm the lead writer over here at Cloud Imperium Games, and I will be your guide on today's fantastical adventure of sadness. So today, we are going to be talking about a system that's pretty heavily steeped in the history of the UEE and was actually also recently featured in the June issue of Jump Point. So if you're a subscriber, you should go check that out. And for those who don't know, we are going to be talking about the Garin system. Now, as always, I'm going to invoke my usual sort of caveat to say that we're still developing this system, so it's possible that some of the elements that we talk about here might change from now until when the system's actually done, but just want to let you know so you can keep that in mind. But anyway, let's get started. So I'm going to head over here to our trusty star map, where we are currently looking at a familiar place called Earth. All right, and let's see. So we're starting off in the Sol system. Okay, let me turn on jump points. There we go. Zoom back. Just for ease's sake, we go 2D. So Garin system is over here. So you can see it's like 4 systems away from Sol. And based on sort of where it's situated here, you can see we got jump points that lead it to Idris and Banshee as far as the UEE goes. It goes to the Lear system, which is an unclaimed system, which is home to the Outsiders, if you are familiar with them. And interestingly enough, it actually, if you follow this path right here, takes you down to Bacchus, which is part of the Banu Protectorate, which is a pretty, actually, kind of fun thing, but we'll get into that a bit later. So one thing actually you'll probably notice if you look closely is that the symbol for Garin is different than sort of all the other ones. It is technically a UEE system, which you can see here and here and here, but it's not, it seems like it's not labeled as such. That's because Garin is what's called a developing system. So it's a system that's basically been put under the Fair Chance Act, which was a sort of a government initiative that was created to protect developing species from interference, so they could basically like develop on their own until they become spacefaring decide to become, or sorry, let me start that again. So one thing you'll probably notice here with the Garin system is actually the symbol for the system itself is a little different than some of the other ones. So these blue ones here are UEE. That one is unclaimed. And even though Garin is technically a UEE system, it actually falls under the Fair Chance Act. So it's actually considered a developing system. And the Fair Chance Act was basically a government bill that was passed that was designed to protect developing species from interference, basically. So basically, we would sort of set up a perimeter around them and shield them from outside interference so they could sort of grow and evolve on their own. And then once they become spacefaring, then we can establish contact and and go from there. So technically, Garin falls under that. And for those of you who are familiar with the system, know that there's sort of a weird backstory to that, but we'll get into that in a second. So anyway, so first off, let's actually talk about the system from a creative standpoint. Garin was actually referenced before the game was even announced, weirdly enough. So it's actually been part of the Star Citizen universe since before the beginning of it, in a sense. I'll include a link in the description to the original post so you can have a read if you haven't seen it, but it was a time capsule. Basically, it was one of the 30 installments that we had released in the days leading up to the original GDC announcement in 2012. And basically, the context for it was a planet of Garin 2 was home to a sentient species that was massacred. And the how and the why why they were massacred, we will get into in a little bit. But we'll start off with a sort of overview of the system itself. So jumping in here, I'll go to 3D because it's super cool. So you can see, in a nutshell, Garin consists of 4 planets, and it was discovered in 2874 by Imperial Pathfinders, who basically immediately turned it over ceded it to UEE control. The central star right here is a G-type dwarf star. So you can see that the green zone here is pretty compact. I think Garin 2 is like roughly 1.1 AU away, so it's a kind of a smaller system. So planet-wise, we have Garin 1 here, which is right on top of this star here. So the surface of it, the idea of it is that it's really hot. That like obviously all the star-facing side of it is just basically like kind of a sea of lava, which personally I'm super jazzed about seeing in the game once it actually happens. But otherwise, there's not much else you can do with it because it's so close to the sun that it's too volatile. So we'll actually skip over Garin 2 for the time being because that's going to be sort of the meat of what we're talking about. No, my fault. So we're going to go out to Garin 3, which is way out here. And Garin 3 is basically situated sort of right on the edge of the frost line here. So that's the green, sort of the green zone. Here's the beginning of the frost line, and then the end of it is sort of out here. So it's sort of right on the edge. But it was sort of, the idea is that it's classified as like a super Earth, but because of its position, basically it's sort of an ice planet. Like there's no life on there. And then last but not least, we have Garin 4, which is way out here. Okay. Which is basically just sort of a small kind of rock out in the middle of nowhere. Not a lot really to speak about. There is actually one of the things that we sort of talked about was that there was a sort of a monument that the UEE built out here called the Sentinel, which was sort of meant to commemorate the tragedy of Garin 2 and sort of remind people not to let that sort of awfulness happen again. So that being said, let's jump into Garin 2. So it was basically a rocky terrestrial planet, but the initial sort of surveyors were thrilled and stunned actually to find that there was a civilization on the planet's surface. And while they hadn't attained any kind of space travel or anything like that, like they were clearly sentient. There was clearly, this was the first steps of a society. So this was huge news at the time. So I mean, because you got to bear in mind that like while we've sort of had indications of like ancient alien civilizations when we discovered planets, there's the ruins in Kazi on Terra, and obviously Hades' system is just a big graveyard. And of course, whatever animals exist on the planets that have sort of, naturally occurring, oxygen atmospheres and stuff like that. Humanity had only encountered other spacefaring sentient species to this point, so this was sort of a huge deal. And so the Imperator at the time was Linton Messer the 11th, and he decided that it was their obligation to uplift the species, and he gave a very powerful public address that featured the phrase "We will be gods," which can only lead to good things. And he was coming at this from the sort of right moral center. So anyway, a team was assembled to sort of to study the culture, and it was put under this guy Michael Cheharelis, and he was sort of tasked with figuring out not only a way to communicate with them, but also exactly how to sort of introduce technology to them. So it wasn't just about landing on the planet and just dropping a spaceship and taking off. Like how to properly kind of bring them up to sort of our level of understanding. So obviously not a very simple prospect. So the team spent years basically sort of being very respectful and unobtrusively kind of studying the aliens and trying to understand their culture, like trying to understand what they had figured out at this point, so we could kind of use that as a frame of reference, all that type of stuff. They also ended up doing very, very thorough scans to really understand like the composition of the planet, the sort of the natural resources there, all that type of stuff. So they had a complete picture that they could work from. So unfortunately for pretty much everybody involved, Linton Messer the 11th was pretty much the sort of embodiment of what 2.5 centuries of viciousness, self-entitlement, and corruption can create. So he was a pretty horrible person. Now, before we continue on, it's actually also important to remember that where the rest of humanity was at this period in time. So this is around 2789. Now you had the murder of Anthony Tanaka was 30 years ago, so the sort of very famous incident where this kid was executed. But since then, the seed of revolution had been slowly stewing. There have been kind of more and more activist groups being formed, and we're getting slightly emboldened, and there was this sort of palpable undercurrent to everything going on. I mean, Linton's father, Ulysses, was aware of it and was convinced, though, that sort of this construction of these sort of massive super complexes that just sort of extolled humanity's greatness and stuff like that would be sort of the answer to it, that would quell everybody and make everybody calm down, because it'd be like, oh, those buildings are super sweet, we're not mad at you anymore, type thing. He's wrong. But anyway, in a sense, when Linton sort of staged a coup to overthrow his father and seize power, basically, part of that was actually his sister Fiona went out and surreptitiously supported some of these activist groups, and the whole thing was sort of kicked off around this thing. He was trying to, Ulysses' sort of legacy was going to be this massive stadium called the Canos Stadium, and at the night of the opening, resistance groups basically bombed it and blew it up. And resistance groups that had been surreptitiously aided by Fiona and consequently Linton basically were responsible for it. And that was what facilitated Linton being able to grab power. So there was a lot of kind of dissent and violence that was brewing just underneath the surface of the UBE. So things were starting to kind of percolate, and Linton either didn't know or didn't care. I mean, you could make the assumption that he probably just assumed that people wouldn't have the backbone to stand up to him, because he'd come from a long line of oppressors, basically. So arrogance was definitely one of his strong suits. So anyway, getting back to the people of Garin 2, years had passed. They're making very slow progress, obviously, because Scheherlis is like being very respectful and all that type of thing. So unfortunately, Linton grew kind of bored with the prospector, just sort of moved on, checked out of that whole idea, or saw something else shiny and went chasing after that. So he kind of gave up on the notion of uplifting the creatures, and especially when he saw one of the very detailed reports listing the volume of resources that the planet had. So he sort of opted for wealth over his own, we will be gods thing. So he completely abandoned Scheherlis' team and retasked them with basically providing information for companies and preparing reports and stuff like that, so he could basically kind of, get terraformers and mining consortiums to start a bidding war and basically rip the planet apart. I mean, just horrible stuff. He would like authorize tours to the planet's surface for executives to personally survey the thing. So of course there are these aliens now there who are freaking out because there's these things coming out of the sky and people walking around and pointing at stuff and taking notes and then getting back and flying away and stuff like that. So they were freaking out, obviously. But he didn't care. They sold off the rights. The imperial coffers swelled, and they flipped the terraformers on. So basically, all life on Garin 2 was asphyxiated to death as their atmosphere was transformed into something that was more habitable, palatable for us, and not for them. So probably one of the more horrifying things that you could do, and callous and heartless and sociopathic, everything. But it was the footage of this that was smuggled out. There was a resistance group called the Tide that smuggled this stuff out, this footage out, and released it to the public, and that turned out to be the catalyst that sparked the revolution. So from there, the revolution caught fire, and it just spread and went like gangbusters, and just everybody was up in arms and managed to do it after a couple hundred years of Messer oppression. They threw them out. So needless to say, in the immediate aftermath of that, the new UEE government was desperate to kind of make amends for this horrible, horrible thing. Now, everything was dead there, so there's not, they couldn't bring them back to life or something like that. But they basically dedicated a lot of resources and minds and companies and stuff like that to try and restore Garin 2 to its original state. So change the atmosphere back, try and replant stuff, all that type of things. And so that's basically where it's been at. It's been sort of this sort of lasting monument to sort of how desperate our greed can become, but also at the same time, it's the symbol of the thing that basically allowed humanity to kind of, take back their destiny, from awful people. So where does that leave us today? So 2947. What is the system like now? As I mentioned earlier, Garin is still technically under the Fair Chance Act, which was enacted, the legislation was actually created to prevent something like this from ever happening again. And so they sort of put the system under its control. Mostly, again, it's a symbolic gesture, but again, just sort of an indication of, that they're committed to not kind of doing this sort of awfulness again. So anyway, so the surface of Garin 2 is off limits to civilians, but yeah, they're still kind of doing what they can to kind of bring it back to the way it was before we screwed it up. So outside of that, you can notice right here by the sun, you have OB Heller, which was actually the original research station that Scheherles's team used to study the planet, and now consequently is what the scientists were using to try and restore the planet. There's also, we were talking about having like basically a museum for about terraforming and sort of the responsibilities of terraforming and stuff like that, to try and educate the people and again, prevent people from ever letting something like this happen again. And it's not situated on the map yet. I mean, I assume that there's, with a lot of our other like developing systems, we have stations that are military bases and stuff. And I assume that there would be some kind of military or law enforcement, but we haven't, as of yet, kind of placed them yet. So as far as training opportunities go, you have there's some mining consortiums set up on Garin 3, which I can't seem to find. There it is. So basically, like, they were to help fund kind of the development of the restoration of Garin 2. The idea was that they needed to generate some extra cash to help support it, and so they did a very deep dive study basically on Garin 3 to make sure that it was obviously not habited, and then they started doing some mining operations on it to help subsidize some of the things they were doing. And but otherwise, as I mentioned before, one of the interesting things is, again, you have a jump point over here to Bacchus. So, basically technically one of the bigger Banu systems. And even though actually technically Coral is considered the more commercial route into Banu space, this is a pretty direct line straight into kind of one of the trading hubs of the Protectorate, and is actually one of the sites of the Gathering, which is what the sort of the Banu events where the leaders kind of get together to talk about civilization spanning issues and stuff like that. So yeah, you basically get a lot of people coming through here to go swing into Banu Space and see what's going on over there, because they're super fun. So yeah, that's pretty much Garin in a nutshell. Again, if you're a subscriber and you'd like to learn more, you should check out the Galactic Guide from the June issue of Jump Point. And there's also actually some additional information in that same month in the portfolio from that month. We did a thing on Rayari, which one of the founders was actually part of Scheherles's original team, and the company helped with some of the restoration stuff, specifically with the agriculture and the plants and stuff like that. So it's pretty fun. Otherwise, you should totally check out, if you haven't poked around the star map here, you should never waste an opportunity to do that. It's very pretty and very addictive. Yeah. Again, I'd like to thank our subscribers for making shows like this possible, and of course a big thank you to our entire community for making all of this possible. So it's great, and I will see you next time.
Thank you for watching. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in Star Citizen and Squadron 42's development, please follow us on our social media channels. See you soon.